Ever wanted to see the death of a channel? Well, you're in luck. Earlier in the month we talked about some stuff that I disliked about Dark Souls 1, and among the pussy bitch kill yourself comments, there was actually some pretty nice positive ones, which is surprising. I thought I was going to get lynched, but the feedback was actually pretty good. So thank you for that, I appreciate it. So how about we tug a little harder and see how far we can push people's buttons. Dark Souls 2, in my opinion, is the weakest Souls game that From Software have ever released. Not to say it's a bad game, it's still stellar, but yes, it's definitely the weakest. With a large portion of the game being scrapped late into the development cycle and them changing a bunch of fundamental aspects of the game, then Tanamara taking over the reins himself, it's a surprise the game is as good as it is, honestly. But among the many flaws that are present in Dark Souls 2, and yes, a Dark Souls 2 What Went Wrong video is on the way, it actually did a lot of things right that would later become common practice in later Souls games and Bloodborne. Now, a lot of these things are little ease of life changes to the mechanics and our UI that I felt were beneficial to the game and had a positive impact on the franchise as a whole. So, without further ado, let's talk about some stuff Dark Souls 2 actually did right. A Soul Vessel is an item in Dark Souls 2 you can use to reallocate your stats. This was the first for the Souls series and was a welcome addition. Find a cool looking weapon but its strength and you're currently on a dex build? Well, first and foremost, what are you doing? Secondly, you can rectify this hideous mistake easily by visiting the old wenches. This aspect doesn't really need explaining as to why this addition is a good thing, but I'll try anyway. With the ability to change your stats, you have multiple ways you can progress your character as you play through the game. Whereas in Dark Souls 1, for example, let's say you get halfway through the game, find a weapon you really like the look of, well, sorry, but you're shit out of luck. You leveled the wrong stats. With the ability to change your stats whenever you'd like, the possibility of further character development coupled with the fact you have the entire game's arsenal at your disposal gives the player freedom of choice. Sometimes choice in how we develop our characters is a good thing, even if Dark Souls is somewhat hardcore, but it's never really been a hardcore role-playing game. But the biggest reason is, well, players can be indecisive, easily influenced, or can just be curious. Giving them the ability to reallocate stats and letting them use whatever they want lets players craft the character they truly want rather than being accidentally shoehorned down a path that can only be fixed by over-leveling your character or starting a new playthrough. In Dark Souls 2, they opted out of the vertical user interface from Dark Souls 1 and went for a grid-based system. This just makes things more easily accessible, easier to navigate, and cleared up a lot of space, allowing more items to be visible on screen. I like to think of user interfaces, whether it be for games or, well, anything. I kinda treat it as if it was an online store. How easy is it for me to find what it is I'm looking for? With Dark Souls 2, the menu system isn't perfect, but it's a lot easier than the previous iterations. Also, I love the fact when you do enter the menu, it shifts to the left hand side, allowing you to see your character when changing weapons and gear, and also, the ability to crush numerous souls is also welcomed as well. The UI and UX took strides into making it more friendly for the user, and you don't really notice unless you actively think about it. Normally, a person will be vocal about something if it's bad or they've had an unpleasant experience. When it's a good experience, 9 times out of 10 it'll fly under the radar because it didn't really warrant a response. But Dark Souls 2's change to the user interface continued into Dark Souls 3, but unfortunately was absent in Bloodborne. Although when talking about that game, with its small cast of weapons, it kind of gets a free pass. Kind of, but that's for another time. Along with what we talked about with the whole respecking thing, this goes into what we'll go over next, and that's build diversity. Even the people who hate the game for God knows what reason, will normally agree that Dark Souls 2 offers the best in that realm. What this means is the tools we the player have at our disposal are vast, and how we can use them then follows suit. Not only that, but only a few of the weapons and spells are, well, kind of bad, leaving an array of weapons and spells that the player can use and feel as though they have chosen the right equipment, and don't feel as though they're hindering themselves. Now, obviously, that's not to say that you can't use bad weapons, but for the average player, most of them want to feel gradually more and more powerful the further you progress in the game. This, along with elemental infusions being somewhat good, poison especially, it gives the players plenty of options, and that is what's key here, and where diversity comes into play. You have options and more options as you progress through the game, and these are accessible because of the respec option. Not only that, but with the ability to power stance weapons, power stance is a system that's unique to Dark Souls 2, where if you have 1.5 times the stats required to wield the weapons, as power stance is a dual wielding system, you'll enter this special pose where you'll get given a unique moveset for the two weapons you've equipped. This to me is one of the best additions Dark Souls 2 has implemented. Again, it's given the players options upon options, and this bleeds into the PvP scene as well. It's pretty common to hear from, again, even those who don't like the game, that Dark Souls 2 had the best player versus player experience, and a lot of that stems down into the fact that there's just a bunch of stuff to use. And you could argue a lot of people were using the meta, but that goes for every game. People who want to do good will always gravitate towards what's best. I think when I stopped PvPing in the game, the mundane Santia spear was the best. Speaking of mundane, I love that stat so much, because it's the community that almost exploited it in a way. Basically, if I were to try and explain it, mundane is a type of infusion that scales off of your lowest stat. Sounds a bit crap. But what if all your stats are the same across the board? Then the infusion would scale off every single one of those stats because they're all your lowest. That's amazing. Again, I'll put emphasis on this as I feel it's the most important when it comes to build diversity that makes it stand out from the rest of the Souls games. Options. I know I keep harking on about it, but it really is key for Dark Souls 2. When you launch a new game, you have to think about where you want to take this character, and you're free to do whatever you want. This obviously is fairly common practice now that respeccing is in Dark Souls 3, but this originated in Dark Souls 2. I do wish they kept the power stance system in Dark Souls 3 though. It really was a lot of fun. I've always been very vocal about how Covenants are very hit and miss, with them lacking any real depth besides a few. The thing I like about the Covenants in Dark Souls 2 is not only are there PvE and PvP ones, but most of the Covenants have a special ring, like some of the Dark Souls 1 Covenants did. But here, they have a nice little impact that coincides with the Covenant you choose. Running a Faith build? Well, if you're in the Heirs of the Sun, your miracle strength will be increased by 5%. This gives the Covenant a sense of identity and an actual reason to enter them. The best thing about the Covenants in Dark Souls 2 is the PvP ones, mainly the Blue Sentinels and the Brotherhood of Blood. Now this is purely down to personal preference obviously, because like I've said before, I thoroughly enjoyed the PvP in Dark Souls 2 and I focused a majority of my time leveling up the PvP Covenants. The key difference here when compared to the other Covenants is how long it actually takes to progress this one. These take a considerable amount of time, 500 victories to be exact, to reach rank 3. We've talked about this in the past on this channel, and I've expressed how much I actually like this. The biggest thing for me is the aesthetic aura obtained by reaching 150 victories. You glow your respective Covenant's colour, and honestly, I'm not really sure why I like it so much. It doesn't affect anything. It just gives you something cool. Could be the fact that I'm quite an envious person if I'm honest. If I see someone who has this aura, I immediately think, wow, that's badass, I want it. But it stems deeper than that. Not only is this purely cosmetic and affects nothing gameplay wise, I mean Jesus, nowadays something as simple as a cosmetic item you'd be looking at forking over some cash for it, but no, here you earn it. Whether you see it or have it, you know that they've or you have invested the time into achieving it, which again takes time and dedication. It gave that audience, the dedicated PvPers, something else to strive for. Something else to do, and that's what Covenant should be in Dark Souls. No, it shouldn't be something you're forced to do, but they need that aspect there to entice players to pick these Covenants, and they need rewards that are good enough that keep the player engaged in whatever activity that the chosen Covenant requires, whether that be PvE or PvP. The Dark Souls 2 Covenants, mainly referring to the PvP and the Company of Champions, are some of the best Covenant experiences you can get in the Souls games. But it's not really hard to be better than shit, is it, Dark Souls 3? In the vanilla version of Dark Souls 2, not Scholar of the First Sin edition, but, you know, the other one, in the weeks before the release of the DLCs, the chest in Majula had a special item in it that changed every week. These ranged from a couple of consumable items to upgrade materials. Then the week before the DLC actually dropped, a super special item was in the chest, a reskinned weapon. Now, although a reskinned weapon might not sound too impressive, in the end it looked cool, but that's not really the point. The point of this little event they ran was mainly focused on community hype, and I was thoroughly hyped through this event. This is mainly down to nostalgia, I suppose, but I remember the weeks leading up to the DLCs, reading on forums, watching streams with people speculating what could be in the treasure chest. It was a very fun time to be a part of the Dark Souls community for me back then. I didn't realise this until Dark Souls 3's DLC, where they didn't do anything. Nothing at all. But with Dark Souls 2, not only were the DLC decent, we had 3 of them, and that tallied the amount of time it takes to do a full run of Dark Souls 2 up substantially. Maybe too much for some, but I quite enjoy the fact that Dark Souls 2 is a huge game. But the reason the DLC releases are here is purely down to the community around that time. The experience I had and the fact, although the reskin weapons might not sound too amazing, it was cool having something others perhaps might not have. Maybe that's the envious personality trait showing its true colours again. Whatever your opinion is on Dark Souls 2, whether that be you hate it or love it, you can't deny Dark Souls 2 made some changes and ran these things that had a positive influence on the series as a whole. Whether that be the introduction of omnidirectional rolling, UI changes, or interesting gameplay mechanics such as power stancing. It's just a shame these little additions got overshadowed by a lackluster PvE experience, which in turn is the main draw to these games, so I can see why people dislike it. But Dark Souls 2 in my book is pretty okay. I've been Paragon. Take care, everyone.